Hello, friends. This is chapter 9 of The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, and the title of this chapter is The Library. And you may follow along in your book with me as I read. Chapter 9. All across the district, the dough and pumpkins were like a great army marching to save us from certain death. Of course, our lives wouldn't return to normal until the harvest, which was still 2 months away. And at night, the same blob of enzema greeted us at supper. But at least it was the start of something better. In the trading center, people began to smile and talk about the future. As the district slowly reclaimed its energy, students at Kachikulo returned to school to resume their studies. But since my parents still couldn't afford my fees, I was forced to stay home. Besides some weeding, there was little work to do in the fields until harvest. I spent a lot of time in the trading center playing bawo. Someone also taught me a wonderful game called chess, which I played every day. But these games weren't enough to keep my mind stimulated. I needed a better hobby, something to trick my brain into being happy. Day and night, all I could think about was school. I missed it terribly. Then I remembered that a small library had opened the previous year in Wembe Primary. It was started by a group called the Malawi Teacher Training Authority, and all the books were donated by the American government. Perhaps reading would keep my brain from getting mushy. The library was housed in a small room by the main office. I entered and was greeted by a nice lady who smiled and said, "Come to borrow some books?" This was Miss Edith Sikelo, who taught English and social studies at Wembe and acted as the school librarian. I nodded, then asked, "How do I do it?" It was my first time ever seeing such a thing. Mrs. Sikelo pulled back a curtain to reveal 3 giant shelves that nearly reached the ceiling, each filled with books. The air smelled sweet and musty, an aroma I'd find comforting from that day forward. She explained the rules of borrowing books and then showed me the many titles available. I expected to find primary readers and other boring Malawian textbooks, but to my surprise, these books came from all over the world. Places like America and England, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. I saw books on English, history, and science, even novels for leisurely reading. I spent hours that morning sitting on the floor, flipping through pages and marveling at the pictures. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to escape without going anywhere. The books from other countries were especially fascinating, but I ended up checking out the same Malawian textbooks my friends were studying at school. It was the end of the semester, and my plan was to get caught up before classes started again. Back at home, I fashioned a hammock from flour sacks and strung it between 2 trees. I spent my mornings at the library, and during the warm afternoons, I read in the shade. Right away, Gilbert offered to help with my independent studies. Each day after school, he stopped by and explained the lessons. "What did you cover in science?" I'd ask. "Weather patterns." "Can I get your notes?" "For sure." But as much as I love to read, I found it terribly difficult. For one, my English was bad, and sounding out words took a great deal of time and energy. Plus, some of the material was confusing since I didn't have a teacher to explain things. "In agriculture," I asked Gilbert, "what do they mean by weathering?" "It's when the rain breaks apart the rocks and soil." "Oh, got it." One Saturday, Gilbert met me at the library just to look at books for fun. We couldn't study all the time. The first thing I spotted was the Malawi Junior Integrated Science book, used by the older high school students. Inside were lots of diagrams and photos of strange and interesting things. People with rabies and children stricken with kwashiorkor. Like so many who'd wandered our country. One picture showed a man in a puffy silver suit. "What's happening here?" I asked. "It says he's walking on the moon," Gilbert said. Impossible. Turning the pages, I saw a photo of Nkulu Falls on the Shire River located in southern Malawi. It's where Eskom operated the hydro plant that I mentioned earlier and where the country got its electricity. The only information I had was that the river flowed downhill until it reached the plant, then poof, there was power. How and why this worked, I had no clue. But this book explained everything. It said the water turned a giant wheel in the plant called a turbine, and the turbine produced electricity. "Well," I told Gilbert, "this sounds exactly like the bicycle dynamo. It lights the bulb by also turning a wheel. The photo of Nkulu Falls made me think about the Dumbo behind my house. During the rainy season, there was always a waterfall. What if I put a dynamo underneath it? I said. The falling water could do the spinning and produce the electricity. We could listen to the radio whenever we wanted. The only problem would be running wires all the way to my house, which would cost a fortune. And what would I do the rest of the year when the marsh was just a soggy swamp? I guess I'll have to research this a little more, I said. Later that day, we came across another fascinating book called Explaining Physics. It was also filled with photos and illustrations, mainly from England. To my surprise, it answered many of the questions I've been asking for a long time, such as how engines burn gasoline in order to move, or how CD players read the music on that shiny disc. For those of you wondering the same, it uses a laser beam. I found an entire section on batteries. Another photo demonstrated on how brakes on a car worked. I'd always assumed that cars use strips of rubber to stop the wheels like on a bicycle. This book said otherwise. Vacuum brakes, I said. Wow, Gilbert, I really need to borrow this book. But Explaining Physics was way more difficult to read than Integrated Science. The words and phrases were long and complicated, and not always easy to translate. After a while, I devised my own system by reading words in context. For example, if I was interested in a photo or illustration labeled Figure 10, and I didn't know what it meant, I'd comb through the text until I found where Figure 10 was mentioned. Then I'd study all the words and sentences around it, often asking Miss Sakalo to look them up in a dictionary. Can you look up the word voltage? I asked. Sure. Any others? Resistor. Oh, and diode. Slowly, this is how I began learning English, as well as the sciences that would soon capture my imagination. After a couple of weeks of reading this book, I came across the most amazing chapter, the discussion of magnets. I knew a little about magnets because they're found in radio speakers. I'd busted off a few and taken them to school as toys, moving slivers of metal around through a piece of paper. The book explained how all magnets have north and south poles. The north pole of one magnet will stick to the south pole of another, while identical poles always resist. You've probably experienced this yourself when playing around with these things. In fact, the Earth itself has a liquid iron core and acts like a giant bar magnet in relation to its poles. Magnets, like the Earth, have natural force fields that radiate between the poles. The south end of a bar magnet will always be pulled towards the north pole of the Earth. That's how a compass works. The bar magnet inside always pulls north to keep you from getting lost. The most fascinating section was about electromagnets, which work by applying power to a coil of wire. According to the book, you can make them out of everyday objects such as nails and batteries. When electricity from a power source, such as a battery, passes through a coil of wire, it generates a magnetic field. This magnetic field can be even greater if the wire is wrapped around a good conductor, like a nail. The more it's wrapped, the stronger the electromagnet. The strength can also be increased by using thicker wire or by applying more power. The book showed giant electromagnets picking up cars and heavy pieces of metal, but smaller ones, it explained, help power simple motors in things like radios and car alternators. Aha! I said aloud. They're talking about radios. I was sitting in my hammock when I read this piece of information. It had taken me over a month to get this far in the chapter, mainly because of all the strange English words to learn. But now I'd reached the juiciest part. How do these motors work? Well, in a simple electric motor, a coil of wire on a shaft sits inside a casing that's actually a large magnet. I knew this much by taking apart radio motors and unraveling the copper wire, mainly to make toys and stuff. When this coil of wire is connected to a battery or any power source, it becomes magnetized. It gets all charged up and wants to fight with the larger magnet surrounding it. The push and pull between their opposing poles causes the shaft to spin. You know the fans that we use in the summer to keep cool, right? The blades are spinning around and around because of this fight going on inside. During all this fighting and spinning around, these motors produce their own kind of energy called alternating current, or AC. There's a second kind of energy called direct current, or DC, but it's mostly found in batteries. Direct current flows in one direction from one end of the battery to the other, while AC changes directions and can be used in more ways. It's also easier to transmit. Because of this, most electronics use AC power. The book gave an example of an AC generating motor, a bicycle dynamo. Aha, I said again, remembering back when Jeffrey and I were playing with the dynamo and trying to power the radio. It didn't work when we attached the wires to the battery terminals, which only used direct current, but when we jammed them into the hole that said AC, the radio had come to life. The book went on. The movement of energy of the dynamo is provided by the rider. Of course, I thought. That's how spinning motion generates power in a dynamo and in the ESCOM turbines on the river. I can't tell you how exciting this was for me. Even if the words and phrases sometimes confused me, the drawings were clear in my mind. It was like seeing an entirely new language composed of symbols, those for AC and DC, positive and negative, batteries and switches in a circuit, and various arrows showing the direction of current. Right away, I understood this language clearly, as if my brain had known it all along. About a month later, school ended for the semester, and Gilbert had more time to hang out. One morning we went to the library, but as soon as we arrived, Mrs. Cicalo hurried us to leave. You boys spend hours in here taking my time, she said, but today I have an appointment. Just find something quickly. The reason it always took so long was because the books were in disarray. They weren't shelved alphabetically or by subject, which meant we had to scan every title to find something we liked. That day, as Gilbert and I looked for something good, I remembered an English word that had stumped me in one of my other books. Gilbert, what does the word grapes mean? He said. Never heard it before. Let's look it up in the dictionary. The English Chichewa dictionaries were kept on the bottom shelf. I'd always used the one on Miss Cicalo's desk, but given her mood, I didn't dare ask for it. I squatted down to grab another dictionary, and when I did, I noticed a book I'd never seen. It was pushed deep into the shelf and was slightly hidden. What is this? I wondered. Pulling it out, I saw it was a textbook from America called Using Energy. And this book has since changed my life. The cover featured a long row of windmills, though at the time I had no idea what a windmill was. All I saw were tall white towers with 3 blades spinning like a fan. Gilbert, I said, calling him over, don't these look like the pinwheels that you, me, and Jeffrey used to make? We used to find old plastic water bottles in the trading center. We'd cut the sides into blades like a fan, drive a nail through the lid, and then hang it on a stick. The wind would spin the blades. A kid's toy. Yeah, he said, you're right. But these things are giant. What are they for? Let's find out. Energy is all around you every day, the book said. Sometimes energy needs to be converted to another form before it is useful to us. How can we convert forms of energy? Read on and you'll see. I read on. Imagine that hostile forces have invaded your town and defeat seems certain. If you needed a hero to save the day, it's unlikely you would go to the nearest university and drag a scientist to the battlefront. Yet, according to legend, it was not a general who saved the Greek city of Syracuse when the Roman fleet attacked it in 214 BC. It explained how Archimedes used his death ray, which was really a lot of mirrors, to reflect the sun onto the enemy ships until one by one they caught fire and sank. This was an example of how you can use the sun to produce energy. Just like with the sun, windmills could also be used to generate power. People throughout Europe and the Middle East use windmills for pumping water and grinding grain, it said. When many wind machines were grouped together on wind farms, they can generate as much electricity as a power plant. It all snapped together. I turned to Gilbert to see if he was reading the same stuff. If the wind spins the blades of a windmill, I said, and the dynamo works by turning the pedals, these two things could work together. I remembered what the book had said about the dynamo. The movement energy is provided by the rider. Gilbert, the rider is the wind. If I could somehow get the wind to spin the blades on a windmill and rotate the magnets in a dynamo, I could create electricity. And if I attached a wire to the dynamo, I could power anything, especially a light bulb. All I needed was a windmill, and I could have lights. No more smoky lanterns that left us with sore throats and hacking coughs. With a windmill, I could stay awake and read instead of going to bed at 7 with the rest of Malawi. But most important, a windmill could also pump water. With most of Malawi still reeling from famine, a water pump could do wonders. At home, we had a small, shallow well that my mother used for cleaning. The only way to get that water was by bucket and rope. But if I attached a windmill and pumped to that well, I could pipe water into our fields. My God, I thought. We could harvest 2 times per year. While the rest of Malawi went hungry during December and January, we'd be picking our second crop of maize. The pump could also allow my mother a year-round garden to grow things like potatoes, mustard greens, and soybeans, both to eat and sell at the market. I began to get excited. No more skipping breakfast, Gilbert. No more dropping out of school. With a windmill, we'd finally release ourselves from the troubles of darkness and hunger. A windmill meant more than just power. It was freedom. Gilbert, I'm going to build a windmill. I'd never tried anything like it before, but I knew that if someone else could build them in Europe and America, then I could build one in Malawi. Gilbert smiled. When do we start? We start today. We're going to split this chapter into 2 parts, and that is the end of part 1 of chapter 9.